Part 9. Paying the price. According to the master formula, in order to get what you want, you must not only know exactly what you want, not only want it hard enough, but also be willing to pay the price of its attainment. We have considered the first and the second of these elements of successful attainment. Let us now consider the third one, and learn what it means to be willing to pay the price of attainment. This final element of successful attainment, this last hurdle in the race, often is the point at which many persons fail. Riding gallantly over the first several hurdles, they stumble and fall when they attempt to surmount this final one. This, not so much because of the real difficulty in passing over this obstacle, but rather because they are apt to underestimate the task and, accordingly, to relax their energies. Thinking that the race is practically over, they fail to observe care and caution and thus meet failure. With the prize almost in hand, they relax their efforts and lose it. The law of compensation is found in full operation in the realm of desire, as well as in every other field and region of life and action. There is always present that insistence upon balance which nature invariably demands from those who seek her prizes. There is always something to be given up, in order that something else may be gained. One cannot have his pie and his dime at the same time. He must spend the dime if he would buy the pie. Neither can one keep his dime and yet spend it. Nature boldly and plainly displays her sign: pay the price. Once more let us quote the old adage, said the gods to man, take what thou wilt but pay the price. When in actual experience you performed the process of selection of the dominant desires, with its attendant struggle for existence and survival of the fittest among the competing desires, even then you are beginning to pay the price of the attainment of your dominant desires. This because you are setting aside and relinquishing one or more sets of desires in favor of a preferred set. Every set of desires has its opposing set, and also other sets which would to some extent interfere with its full manifestation. You must pay the price of attainment of the one set of desires by relinquishing the other sets. In order to attain the object of your desire for wealth, you must pay the price of relinquishing desires for certain things which would prevent you from accumulating money. In order to attain the object of your desire for all possible knowledge in some particular field of study and research, you must pay the price of relinquishing your desires for a similar degree of knowledge in some other field of thought and study. In order to attain the object of your desire for business success, you must pay the price of hard work and the passing by of the objects of your desires for play, amusement, and enjoyment which would necessitate the neglect of your business. And so on. To attain the object of any one set of desires, you must always pay the price of the relinquishing of the objects of other sets of desires. In some cases, this process of the inhibition of opposing desires is akin to that of weeding your garden, or of pruning your trees, getting rid of the useless and harmful growths which interfere with the growth and development of the useful and advantageous thing. In other cases, however, the desires which you must inhibit and put away from you are not in themselves harmful or useless. On the contrary, they may be very advantageous and useful in themselves, and may be actually worthy of being adopted as dominant desires by others, but, at the same time, they are of such a nature as to prove an obstacle to your progress along the line of your own chosen dominant desires. Things may oppose and antagonize each other without either of them being harmful or bad in themselves. You cannot travel at the same time both forks of the road, nor can you travel north and south on any road at the same time, though either of these courses of travel may be good in itself. You cannot very well be a successful clergyman and a successful lawyer at the same time if you have strong desires for both of these careers. You must choose the one you desire more and set aside the other. The girl with the two attractive suitors, the man with the two delightful sweethearts, the child with the dime, gazing longingly at the two different tarts, each must choose one and pass by the other, and thus pay the price. Not only in the preliminary process of discovering and identifying your dominant desires are you called upon to pay the price, but you are equally called upon to do so at almost every subsequent step and stage of your progress in actual experience. There is always something presenting itself to tempt you into sidetracking your desire power, some alluring desires which beckon you from the straight path of attainment. Here you will find that it is hard to pay the price, and often you will gravely question yourself, asking if the things represented by the dominant desires are, after all, worth the price you are being called on to pay for them. These temptations and struggles come to all they constitute one of the tests whereby it is determined whether you are strong or whether you are weak in regard to your desire power. Here is the real test of whether or not you want it hard enough to make you willing to pay the price. Particularly difficult to overcome and conquer are those temptations which induce you to relinquish your desire for future attainment in favor of the gratification of present desires, or which tempt you to forego the attainment of permanent future benefits in favor of temporary, ephemeral present benefits. The tempter whispers in your ear that you are foolish to content yourself with the skim milk of the present in the hope of obtaining the full cream of tomorrow. The ever-present suggestion to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, must be boldly confronted and conquered if you wish to attain the object of that which your reason and judgment, as well as your self-analysis, has shown that you really want above everything else. The habit of saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan," must be cultivated, and when you have got him behind you, look out lest he give you a push from behind. Here you determine whether or not you really want it hard enough. The drowning man is in no doubt concerning the value of the breath of air. He is willing to pay the price of it, no matter how high that price may be. The famishing man knows the value of food. The parched man knows the value of water. They are willing to pay the price, and are not liable to be sidetracked from their dominant desire. The bull moose seeking his mate is willing to pay the price of danger and possible death lying in his path, but you cannot sidetrack him. The mother tiger cannot be sidetracked from the pursuit of food for her hungry cubs. She is willing to pay the price of risk of life without hesitation. When you begin to want it hard enough along the same lines, and reaching toward the same degree of intensity and insistence manifested by these creatures, then you will not hesitate to pay the price, to pay it in full, and without hesitation. When you reach this stage, the tempter will whisper into ears deaf to his voice. In order to hold the current of desire power within the bounds of your channels of dominant desire, the banks must be erected and kept in a state of strength by willpower. The will to will must be called into manifestation. While desire is one of the fundamental elements of will, it is not all of will. Will is a subtle combination of cognitive desire and of purposeful determination. It springs from desire, but it evolves into something which is capable of mastering desire by its power of willing to will. In the book of this series entitled Will Power, the subject of will in all of its phases is considered in detail. Those who are specially interested in this phase of the general subject are referred to the said book. It should prove helpful to them. Here follow 3 general rules which you should note very carefully in connection with the subject of inhibiting and setting aside the temptations of conflicting desires, of those desires which are constantly springing up and tempting you to forego paying the price, or to become sidetracked from the path of attainment of your dominant desires. 2 of these rules are along the lines of which we have spoken in connection with the influence of representative ideas upon desire power. Under temptation by sidetracking desires, use every effort to feed the flame of desire of your dominant desires, by an increased supply of suggestive ideas and mental pictures tending to stimulate its beat and incite its energy. 2. At the same time, strenuously avoid feeding the flame of the tempting desires by suggestive ideas and mental pictures likely to arouse or incite them. On the contrary, carefully and positively refuse to admit such ideas and pictures to your mind. So far as is possible, seek to starve the fires of such desires by withholding from them the fuel necessary for their continuance and support. The third rule involves another psychological principle, and is as follows. 3. So far as is possible, transmute the sidetracking desires into forms more in accordance with the general trend of the dominant desires, thereby converting them into helpful rather than harmful emotional energy. In the case of the first rule above stated, you tend to inhibit the energy of the sidetracking desires by imparting additional energy to the dominant desires. When the attention is strongly attracted or held by the suggestive ideas and mental pictures of a strong set of desires, it is not easily diverted by those of a weaker set. The strong light of the former tend to cast the latter into a comparative shadow. The attention firmly concentrated and held upon one particular set of ideas and mental pictures refuses to accept the demand of another set. Keep the attention busy with the advantageous set, and it will have no time for the consideration of the opposing set. With these opposing suggestive ideas and mental pictures kept out of the field of conscious attention, the desires associated with them tend to die down and finally to disappear. In the case of the second rule above stated, you deliberately and determinedly refuse to feed the flame of the sidetracking desires with the fuel of suggestive ideas and mental pictures. Instead, you proceed deliberately and determinedly to starve that flame. No flame of desire can long continue to burn vigorously if its supply of suggestive fuel be cut off from it. Cut off the fuel supply of any desire, and it will begin to decrease in vigor and force. Refuse to allow your mind to dwell upon the ideas or mental pictures tending to suggest the sidetracking desires. When such ideas and pictures intrude themselves and seek to attract the attention, you must deliberately turn your attention to something else, preferably to the suggestive ideas and pictures of your dominant desires. The Roman Catholic Church evidently recognizes the value of this rule, for its teachers instruct their pupils to form the habit of turning their attention to prayers and certain forms of devotional exercises when temptations assail them. The attention being directed to and held firmly upon the devotional exercise or ceremony, it is withheld from the suggestive ideas and mental pictures of the tempting desire and, accordingly, the latter loses strength and in time dies away. Without detracting from the value of the religious element involved, we may say that it is certain that the purely psychological effect of such course is highly advantageous. You would do well to apply the principle in your own case. In the case of the third rule above stated, you transmute the energy of the sidetracking desire into that of desires more in accordance with the general trend of your dominant desires. In this way, you not only obviate the danger of the interference and distraction of the sidetracking desires, but also actually employ the basic energy of desire power to feed the flame of the advantageous desires. Here, the principle involved is not so well known as are those involved in the other rules, but that principle is sound, nevertheless, and is capable of being employed with remarkable results by the individual possessing sufficient willpower and determination to apply it. As an example of this principle of the transmutation of the form of desire force, let us point you to a fact well known to scientific observers, viz., that the energy of the sexual passions may be transmuted into the energy of any kind of mental or physical creative work. This fact is also known to priests and others who are called on for advice from those wishing to control passions of this kind. The explanation probably lies in the fact that sexual desire is essentially creative in its fundamental nature, and therefore is capable of being diverted to other forms of creative activity. But whatever may be the true explanation, it is a fact that the person experiencing strong intruding sexual desires may proceed to master and control them by means of engaging in some form of creative work in which the elemental creative energy is transmuted into other forms of creative force. For instance, one may create by writing, musical composition, artistic work, or making and constructing things with the hands, in fact, by any kind of work in which things are made, put together, constructed, or created in any way. In all of such work, provided that sufficient interest is thrown into the task, it will be found that the strong impulse of the intruding sexual passions will gradually lose its force, and that the person will then experience a sense of new energy in the creative work which he has undertaken in order to transmute the previous form of desire power. The experienced physician knows that the best possible prescription for certain classes of cases of this kind coming to him for treatment and advice is that of interesting work for head or hands or both. There is much truth in the old saying that an idle brain is the devil's workshop, and the similar one that the devil finds plenty of work for idle hands to do. This principle may be set to work against the devil, by simply reversing its action by giving head and hands plenty to do. Another illustration of this principle is found in the case of the beneficial effect of certain games, in fact, of nearly all games played in moderation. Here the sidetracking and distracting desires which seek to take one away from his appointed tasks, and from the manifestation of his dominant desires, are transmuted into the interest, feeling, and desires of play. Play is a safety valve of emotional feeling. It serves to transmute many a distracting desire into the conative energy expressing itself in an interesting game. This is true of games involving purely mental skill, as well as those in which physical skill is also involved. Baseball has been a wonderful benefit to the American people in this way. Golf is playing an important part in the direction of affording a transmutation channel of energy for busy men who tire under the somewhat monotonous strain of the strenuous pursuit of the object of their dominant desires. In cases of this kind, Not only are the distracting desires transmuted in this way, but the games themselves give recreation, exercise and a restful change of occupation to the individual. Paying the price of your dominant desires does not necessarily imply that you must give up everything in life not actually concerned in furthering the interest of those particular desires. In such case, indeed, you would probably actually injure your own interests by too closely restricting your circle of interest and attention. The real meaning of the injunction is that you must pay the price of giving up, inhibiting, or at least transmuting any and all desires which directly and certainly oppose and seriously interfere with the attainment of the objects of your dominant desires. That price, indeed, you must be prepared to pay. In many cases, such desires may be transmuted into forms which will in a sense run along with the pursuit of the objects of your dominant desires, and thus be rendered helpful rather than harmful. Many emotional elements may be turned to account in this way by the process of transmutation. You should give some thought to this matter of transmutation when you are threatened by distracting and sidetracking desires. Another form of paying the price is that of the labor and work to be performed by the individual in his task of attainment of the object of his dominant desires. This work and labor, however, is not alone performed by the exercise of the persistent determination of the will. Though this is the active element involved, there is needed also the inhibition and starving out of the conflicting or sidetracking desires which strive to draw the individual away from his appointed tasks and toward the actions requiring less work, and which for the time being seem to be richer in promise of pleasure and satisfaction. The price paid by the men and women who have achieved marked success almost always is found to include self-denial, and sometimes even actual privation during the earlier days of the undertaking, work far in excess of that rightfully demanded of the wage earner, both in amount and in time is demanded of them. Application and unwearied perseverance are required of them. Indomitable resolution and persistent determination must be paid by them. There is here the constant giving up of the present pleasure in favor of that hoped for in the future. There is here the constant performance of tasks which might easily be avoided, and which are really avoided by the average person, but which are required to be performed by the individual who is inspired by the dominant desire and who is working for the accomplishment of the one big thing. Napoleon paid the price in his earlier days when he refused to indulge in the frivolous pursuits of his fellow students at Brienne, and instead, deliberately devoted his spare time to the mastery of the elements of military science and history. Abraham Lincoln paid the price when he studied the few books he could find by the light of the fireplace, instead of indulging in the pleasures and dissipations of the other young men of his neighborhood. Read the history of any successful man and you will find this invariable paying the price of study, application, work, self-denial, economy, thrift, industry, and the rest of the needful things. Never delude yourself with the thought that you can escape paying the price of the attainment of the objects of your strong desires. The price must always be paid. The greater the object of attainment, the greater is the price demanded. But you will find that if you have learned how to want it hard enough, then the price will be comparatively easy to pay. The thing will be deemed well worth it. If you feel that the price that you are being called upon to pay for the object of your dominant desires is more than the thing is worth, then there is something wrong about the whole matter. In such case, you should carefully take stock of your feelings, weighing and comparing them carefully as we have suggested in our consideration of self-analysis and selection of dominant desires. You may find that what you had supposed to be a dominant desire is not really such at all, or you may find that you have failed to include some necessary element or phase of the dominant desire, or that you have failed to make some possible transmutation of distracting desires, or have failed to inhibit or starve out sidetracking desires, or, possibly, that you have failed to feed the flame of your dominant desire properly. At any rate, there is something wrong in such a case, and you should seek the remedy. While the law of nature provides that you must pay the price of the attainment of any and all desires, it also provides that the attainment must always be worth the price. If you find that the present and probable future value of any object of your desire is not worth the price you must be called upon to pay for it, then you should carefully consider the whole matter most critically, viewing it from all angles, and in the light of all possible relations and associations, with full deliberation concerning the probable consequences of an opposite course, and with thoughtful judgment concerning all alternative courses. The dissatisfaction may be merely temporary and passing, or on the other hand, it may be growing in strength and promise of permanency. Any desire which upon careful consideration, deliberation, and judgment may seem not to pay for its keep, to be not worth its storage charges or floor space in your emotional nature, is a fit object for a final retrial upon its merits, a reevaluation of its points, in order to decide whether it shall be retained and treated for additional strength, energy, and emotional value, or else discarded and rejected. The test should always be, is this really worth the price I am called on to pay for it? Would its rejection cost me more than its retention? The touchstone of marriage should be, does this render me stronger, better, and more efficient, and, therefore, more truly and permanently happier? In the history of philosophy we find many theories concerned with the matter of the satisfaction of pleasurable desires and the avoidance of pain, the achievement of the greatest possible amount and degree of contenting of the spirit of the individual. The ancient Greek philosophers especially devoted much attention to this particular subject, but they failed to come to a common understanding. The Epicureans held that the chief end of life is to obtain the greatest satisfaction of the pleasurable desires. The Stoics, on the contrary, held that the chief end of life is to avoid and escape pain. Between these two poles raged the conflict of thought on the subject. Some emphasize the fact that an excess of pleasure brings about a reaction of satiety and even actual pain, while even in continued pain there is to be found a compensating element of resignation and inner content of a spiritual nature. Here, as elsewhere, the truth seems to lie between the two extremes at the point of the golden mean. Nothing too much is the axiom of those who perceive the danger of proceeding to extremes in anything. They hold that while the satisfaction of the pleasurable desires is proper and good, yet there is an element of benefit even in a moderate degree of pain. Without pain, they say, there is no contrast by reason of which pleasure is appreciated. The escape from pain, or the avoidance of pain, is doubly pleasurable when the nature of the pain is known by experience. But, even here, we find the tacit admission that the chief end of life is the attainment of happiness, the content of the spirit for which all living things, consciously or unconsciously, strive. Perhaps the most practical of all the philosophical theories upon the subject of the securing of the maximum of pleasure and the minimum of pain is that theory without a name, but which is followed by many of the strongest and most successful men of the world. This theory combines the principles of both Epicureanism and of Stoicism, and seemingly blends them in a practical harmony. The cardinal principle of this practical philosophy may be expressed in the following adage: sacrifice the lesser pleasure to the greater, taking into consideration the element of permanency and ultimate value. If any desire is found to result in a greater degree of pain than of pleasure, sacrifice it, unless it contributes to the success of a greater desire. If it results in a greater degree of pleasure than of pain, preserve it, unless it tends to weaken or to interfere with the success of a greater desire. In the consideration of the above, you must never lose sight of the fact that the greater desires, or the greater pleasure, may consist of the satisfaction arising from the performance of duty, and of the practice of rational altruism. In fact, it often does so, for acts of duty, altruism, patriotism, self-sacrifice for an ideal, etc., are performed only when there is secured a greater content of spirit by the performance or practice, than by the opposite course. So, at the last, recognizing that you must always pay the price, you are justified in seeking to get the greatest satisfaction for the price paid, and to refuse to accept emotional goods which are not worth the price demanded for them. There should be observed an economy of desire, by means of which the law of compensation is made to yield a full return for every expenditure. You should always get your money's worth when you pay the price, and it behooves you to examine carefully the wares offered for sale on the counters of desire. If you find that you have any unprofitable desires, not worth the price which you are continually being called upon to pay for them, did not hesitate to scrap them at once. At least, strive to retain only such dominant desires as will in the end enable of you to say, honestly, to yourself, it was well worth the price it cost. I am satisfied. Summary: you have seen that desire is that emotional state which is represented by the phrase, I want. You have seen that desire has for its object something which will bring pleasure or get rid of pain, immediate or remote, for the individual or for someone in whom he is interested. You have seen that you always act according to your greatest a like or a dislike of which you are cognizant at the time. You have seen that the degree of force, energy, will, determination, persistence, and continuous application manifested by an individual in his aspirations, ambitions, aims, performances, actions and work is determined primarily by the degree of his desire for the attainment of the objects thereof, his degree of a want to concerning that object. You have seen that desire is the flame that produces the steam of will, and that, therefore, desire is the source from which all human action springs. You have seen that not only does desire power directly or indirectly cause all human action, but that it also sets into operation the life forces which develop the mental and physical faculties and powers of the individual along lines designed to further and more efficiently manifest and express the dominant desires of the individual. You have seen how desire power presses into service the powers of the subconscious mentality in the work of manifesting and expressing the strong desires. You have seen how the subconscious powers act so as to attract to the individual the things, persons, conditions, and circumstances serving to enable him to better manifest and express his sovereign desires, and how, in the same way, they tend to attract the individual to those things, persons, conditions, and circumstances. You have seen how desire attraction works silently, even when one is asleep, toward the end impressed upon it by the character of the strong desires. You have discovered the importance of knowing exactly what you want, and have learned how to gain such important knowledge by self-analysis and selection. You have discovered the importance of wanting it hard enough, and have learned how to feed the flame of desire so as to cause it to burn fiercely. You have learned how to set into motion and activity the great body of elemental desire, and how to cause it to flow forth through the channels of manifestation and expression which you have carefully built for its flood. You have discovered the necessity of paying the price of attainment of the objects of your desire, and have learned the general rules concerning such payment. You have been informed concerning the tremendous power of the desire power within your being, and have become acquainted with the laws governing its manifestation and expression, and the rules regulating its control and direction. If you have entered into the spirit of this instruction, and have allowed its influence to descend into the subconscious depths of your mentality, you have already become aware of the aroused energy of the desire power in those depths. You will have found yourself filled with a new and unfolding consciousness of personal power within you. You will have experienced that intuitive feeling that there have been set into operation in you certain subtle but dynamic forces which will tend to make you stronger, better, and more efficient. As you proceed to arouse into further activity these great forces of your nature, and to direct their channel of manifestation and expression, you will from time to time receive actual evidence and proof that you are traveling along the right road, and are employing the proper methods. You will be astonished to receive proofs and actual results in the most unexpected manner, and from sources and directions never dreamt of before. You will realize more and more, as you proceed, that you have set into operation one of nature's most potent forces, in fact, the force of forces. Finally, you will begin to realize that the very actual presence within you of a dominant desire which has won its place in the struggle for existence, and which has stood all the tests, is practically the prophecy of its own fulfillment.